we have to have a sense or a direction as to where are we going? Where did we come from and where are we going? And this pertains to a discussion that we had on Thursday nights, probably 3 years ago or so, when we spoke for several weeks on the ages of God. You remember that? Now, when we talk, I'm not going to go back into an in-depth talk about the ages of God, but understand when we talk about the ages of God, we're not talking about astrology. Astrology, the Babylonian zodiac, all these things were perversions of something that existed originally, and then were taken into their own vein. So in the very beginning, we had no writing, we had no mass media, we had none of that. So the way things were carried on were through stories. And so the fathers would speak to their children about the past. They would pass these stories on. They would go down until finally, a few thousand years ago, writing was invented, and then these things were codified in written form. But before that, it was in story form. So when Abraham talked to his family, talked to Isaac, he looked up into the sky, and he looked at the sky, and he told a story by what was written in the stars. Were they really written in the stars? No. They were images that were placed in the stars. When you look at a constellation, can you really see that constellation? No, you get 3 or 4 stars, and then somebody draws the whole picture, and you say, oh, that's this constellation. But it was a method whereby in stories and pictures, you could pass on the story of God through the 12 signs of the Mazzaroth that the Bible calls the Mazzaroth. Okay. So we won't go in detail there, except to say that there has to be a change from one age to the other in a progression in God. And we are at the point now where we are changing from one age to another. We are in a transition period in the earth. These ages last, if you remember from the study, roughly 2,000 years. So if we look at biblical chronology, we don't know how many ages were before the creation or before the Adam and Eve. So we're not certain how many ages were before. We don't know how many ages there will yet be, but we know there will be ages plural, because the Apostle Paul said that in the ages to come, he will show forth his glory in various ways. So we know there will be ages in the future. In fact, Jesus said what? This type of situation will not be taken care of in this age or in the age to come. So even Jesus said, you know where I am? I mean, where Jesus was? There's an age coming after me. There are ages coming past me. Okay, so the reason this is important is because we have to see where we are in this progression of God so that we start looking toward what God is doing in our transition. The tendency when things are shaking is always let us go back. What happens to people who are in desperate, shaking situations? They don't understand, they're in fear. They want someone to do something, and they're willing to give up almost anything if someone will do it. I'll give up my liberty, I'll give up my future, whatever. Just somebody, please do something. Well, the someone who's going to do something are the people of God in our particular time. So Jesus had mentioned this as well when he spoke about, remember Jesus spoke about you don't put new wine in old wineskins, and you don't put a new piece of cloth on an old garment. Why? What happens if you do that? You're going to destroy it. You can't put the things of God that are new into an old wine sack. You can't put them into an old mentality. You can't put the things God is going to do and is in the process of doing now into a mixed covenant thinking, into a religious thinking. because it will destroy it. It will not produce anything. It'll be like putting a piece of new cloth on an old garment, and it will tear the garment even worse. Or putting new wine in an old wineskin. Now you can put a new patch on an old garment, and you can put new wine in an old wineskin, but the wineskin and the garment have to be prepared to handle it. So you can make a wineskin supple again so it is able to handle the new wine and not burst from the process that goes on. You can do that, but you can't put it in order. So don't think you're going to go into the new by living in the old. So Jesus made different references to this throughout his ministry. Now, when they had left, as we read here in Hebrews, when they were in the transition, think of what an amazing and difficult transition this was for the people. Because they are walking after a way that they had been doing for 1,500 years or thereabouts. They had been following the order of the Aaronic priesthood. They had their tabernacles and then later temples. They were offering sacrifices. They were following the religious customs that were given to them. They were saying prayers as they were taught to say those prayers. They were looking for a future day, the Messiah, but they couldn't see the Messiah when he came because they were still living in the entrapment of their condition. So if you were a Jew living in the days of Jesus, think how different, or the days of the apostles, think how difficult this must have been. And so we have some indication in the Word of God how difficult it was for them in different ways. Because 15 years after Jesus resurrects, they have to have a council in Jerusalem and say, do people really have to be circumcised to be saved? The John the Baptist, remember, I must decrease. See, there's a new age coming, and Jesus is the instrument of that new age. I am the transitional figure. John the Baptist, why was he the greatest of all prophets and he never did a miracle? He was the greatest of all prophets because of his position. He was a transition. The law and the prophets were until John the Baptist. The whole old covenant was until John, but now John the Baptist comes and he's the transitional figure to transition the world and to transition the Jewish into the new way. And so, but then he says, eventually he says, I must decrease and you must increase. This transition has to end now and something new has to begin. And what happens to John? Has his head cut off. And then the Apostle Paul, who is the head of the gospel to the Gentiles. Peter brought it to the Jews and Paul brought it to the Gentiles. He was the one who brought this gospel to the Gentiles, and history tells us, how did he die? He had his head cut off. Then you go to chapter 20, and this is chapter 20 of the book of Revelations, and it says these are those that were beheaded for their testimony. Where they literally had their head. No, you have to have the carnality. The way you think has to be cut off. It's symbolic. The way I think about the world, about life, about what is God and what isn't God, or the way I think about my fellow man, the way I conduct myself. This cannot be of the flesh. This cannot be of my carnal nature. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and I do what's best for me, and worry about your own stuff. And no, there has to be a transition in the thinking. There has to be a new head, so to speak. Well, what's the new head? Jesus, the revelation of Jesus, the way he thinks, the way he acts, the way he he feels, his desire. That has to be the way I desire. The way he sees has to become the way I see. This is the transition in the ages.